At 10:30 p.m., the tide was supposed to fall. It didn't. The sea did not retreat. It kept rising through the night. By dawn, entire communities were gone. More than 2,500 people would never wake again.
The night of January 31st, 1953, began like any other winter evening across the North Sea coast. Families tucked their children into bed, fishermen secured their vessels, and passengers boarded ferries for what seemed like routine crossings. The wind outside was howling with unusual ferocity, but few could imagine that by dawn, entire communities would vanish beneath the waves. Many went to sleep that night, never to wake again. The vulnerability of these regions was not accidental. It was the product of centuries of human ambition. Approximately 20% of the Netherlands sat below sea level in 1953, protected by an intricate network of dikes, canals, and seawalls built incrementally over more than 1,000 years. Each generation had added to these defenses, reclaiming land from the sea and treating each victory as permanent. In England, communities like Canvey Island existed in the same precarious balance, their homes and businesses occupying land that nature never intended to be dry. The confidence bred by centuries of successful flood management would prove dangerously misplaced. The storm that struck was no ordinary weather event. A deep Atlantic depression moved eastward with unusual speed and violence, arriving on January 31st with hurricane-force winds exceeding 100 miles per hour. What made it uniquely deadly was its convergence with one of the highest spring tides of the year. As the depression pushed south through the North Sea, it drove an enormous wall of water ahead of it. The shallow basin of the North Sea, rarely more than a few dozen meters deep, acted as a funnel, concentrating the storm's energy and amplifying the surge as it approached the coast. By the time it made landfall, the surge reached heights of over 11 feet above normal high tide levels. Meteorologists had no historical precedent to draw from. Nothing in the record books had prepared them for this. At 7:45 a.m. on January 31st, the MV Princess Victoria departed Stranraer for her routine 45-minute crossing to Lorne in Northern Ireland. She carried 179 people, including 49 crew members. Captain James Ferguson knew conditions were rough, but the route had been sailed in bad weather many times before. What he could not have known was that his ship was sailing directly into the storm's path at its most violent. The Princess Victoria was one of the first roll-on/roll-off ferries, a modern design that allowed vehicles to drive aboard through large stern doors. That innovation became her fatal weakness. As she cleared the shelter of Loch Ryan and met the full force of the northwestern gale, mountainous waves began destroying the stern doors. Water poured onto the vehicle deck faster than the pumps could manage, and the ship developed a severe list to starboard. The captain attempted to turn back toward the Scottish coast, but the engines were flooding and control was failing. The radio operator sent increasingly desperate distress calls as the ship broke apart. Of the 179 people on board, 135 died. There were no women or children among the survivors, indicating that evacuation procedures collapsed entirely under the conditions. It remains one of the worst peacetime maritime disasters in British history. While the Princess Victoria fought for survival in the North Channel, The storm surge was advancing toward the Dutch and English coasts with catastrophic speed. In the Dutch province of Zeeland, the dikes failed not gradually but suddenly at 150 separate locations throughout the night. In the village of Ouderkerk, residents were not awakened by the sound of rising water, but by the roar of their seawall disintegrating. The surge moved inland at the speed of a racing car, carrying houses, livestock, and everything in its path. On Canvey Island in Essex, the situation was equally desperate. Home to 13,000 residents and connected to the mainland by a single road bridge, the island had almost no viable evacuation route. The first seawall breach occurred at Tukes Creek, through which millions of gallons of water poured within minutes. Families in the lowest-lying areas were trapped on upper floors, then on rooftops, then clinging to chimney stacks as their neighborhoods disappeared beneath the water. In total darkness with no warning systems in place, many survived only because neighbors launched small boats into the floodwaters at enormous personal risk. What made this disaster uniquely disorienting, even for experienced coastal residents, was a meteorological anomaly that overturned centuries of predictable tidal behavior. Around 10:30 p.m. on January 31st, low tide was due along the southern North Sea coast. It never came. The combination of extraordinarily low atmospheric pressure and sustained hurricane-force winds prevented the sea from receding as expected. Water levels remained near their peak throughout what should have been low tide. When the following morning's high tide arrived, it began from an already dangerously elevated baseline, producing sea levels approximately 3 meters above forecast. People who had lived through dozens of storms and hundreds of high tides could not understand what they were witnessing. The sea appeared to be ignoring the laws of physics. In a practical sense, for those hours, it was. When February 1st arrived, the scale of what had happened became visible in full daylight. The Princess Victoria had sunk with 135 fatalities. In the Netherlands, 1,836 people had died. Dikes had been breached at over 150 locations, flooding approximately 160,000 hectares of land. More than 24,000 homes were destroyed completely, with another 19,000 severely damaged. Hundreds of thousands of people were left homeless in the middle of winter. The village of Stavenis, in Zeeland, lost 305 of its 3,100 inhabitants. Entire communities that had existed for centuries were reduced to debris-filled lagoons. Across the Netherlands, Belgium, and England, the combined death toll exceeded 2,500. The disaster forced a complete reassessment of flood defense philosophy across northwestern Europe. The Netherlands launched the Delta Works, the most ambitious flood protection engineering project in history. Over the following decades, a system of dams, sluices, locks, reinforced dikes, and storm surge barriers was constructed across the Rhine-Meuse-Scheldt Delta. The project was not completed until 1997. It remains one of the 7 wonders of the modern world, according to the American Society of Civil Engineers. Britain established its first modern storm surge warning system, with monitoring networks capable of providing coastal communities with advance notice of extreme surge events. The Thames Barrier, completed in 1982, stands as a direct consequence of the 1953 disaster. International maritime regulations were overhauled following the Princess Victoria inquiry, with new requirements for stern door design, emergency procedures, and weather routing that changed ferry safety standards permanently. The North Sea flood of 1953 is one of the most significant natural disasters in modern European history, measured not only by the lives lost, but by the transformation it forced in how governments, engineers, and communities relate to the sea. The defenses that failed that night had been built by generations of careful, experienced people. They failed anyway, because nature produced conditions no historical experience had made imaginable. That recognition, that vigilance and engineering must evolve continuously rather than rest on past success, remains the most important legacy of February 1st, 1953. As sea levels rise and extreme weather events intensify, the events of that night carry a warning that has not diminished with time. Behind every storm, there are human stories. Subscribe, and let's continue telling them together. Thank you for watching. See you in the next video.